Hello to everybody who's tuning in to this special JCC live presentation of how to find your family's military records. I'm so glad you could join us either live or later on demand. I'm Ellin Bessner and I'm going to be your host for the next half an hour. It's a pleasure to be here as we all get through the coronavirus pandemic. And I have a question for you. Do you have a box in your house? A box maybe with old military records, medals of a lost loved one in a war, World War I, World War II. Do you have souvenirs that they may have brought home? Someone has a box. Every family has somebody that has a box with photos that they've never gone through or never thrown out because they just couldn't throw it out. Well, now we have lots of time, supposedly over the next while to go through our projects. And so what better time to tackle the box and finally find out what your family's military service records mean and get to the bottom of what they did during these important Canadian and world milestone wars. Especially as this year is the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II. And last year was, 2 years ago was the end of the 100th anniversary of the end of World War I. So there are very few veterans still around who can tell the stories to you firsthand or give you their experiences one-on-one. There are none from World War I, so many of you will have the privilege now of learning how to find their records online and other methods to search what your family members and loved ones did to save the world from another threat, not a pandemic, but other kinds of threats to democracy, freedom, and of course to the Jewish people themselves in World War II. So let me tell you a little bit about myself and then give you the agenda for how today is going to go. So I'm Ellin Bessner. I'm an author. I'm a professor at Centennial College in Toronto, and I'm a journalist. I've spent the past nearly decade researching the stories of Canada's 17,000 Canadians of Jewish faith who served in World War II and World War I. There were about 4,700 Canadians who served in World War I in the Canadian Forces. And I've written a book, as you can see behind me, that was out last year called Double Threat: Canadian Jews, the Military, and World War II, published by the University of Toronto Press. And I've been going around the world, in Canada, North America, and the world, speaking to groups large and small, educating them about this important untold story of the Canadians who put on a uniform and fought for king and country in World War II, plus to save their own people from Hitler's final solution. I've also written a part of the Canadian Jewish News' forthcoming book called Northern Lights about the entire history of Canada's fighting Jews from the Plains of Abraham in 1760 to today, including the latest wars in Afghanistan. But we won't be covering that period, the Afghanistan fighting, because the veterans are still alive, most of them who were not killed, of course, and you cannot get their military records unless you are directly them or their next of kin, and only for very special medical or PTSD reasons. So I'm not going to focus on that today for the Afghan war. So here's the agenda. I'm going to share my screen with you now for the next little while and show you some slides and some links. And then why should you embark on this project? And why did I embark on this project? Then what do you have at home and what do you want to learn about your relatives? And then where to research both online and in person. And finally, at the end, I'll give you a slide how to get in touch with me, to ask me questions personally about your own case, and I'll be able to try to help you as best as I can. So if we're okay with that, let's go. So in this seminar, these are the three things that you should come away with at the end. Number one, you will learn that finding your family and their history in the military is important and rewarding and sometimes heartbreaking and sometimes beautiful and sometimes amazing and cool too. Number two, you will gain great detective skills. You'll be a great researcher. If you're like me, there's always someone in the family who cares about this stuff while everyone else rolls their eyes and doesn't care. So hopefully this will help you be a better researcher and join the community of historians and genealogical researchers like me who have a community that they like to help each other, and so I'm trying to give back by helping you. And the good thing about doing this research is during your journey, I promise you, you will meet like-minded relatives, maybe who you haven't met, and you will meet some complete strangers who will help you to find what happened to your family. All right, so how did this all get started? Well, this is me in 2011 at Juno Beach in France. And I'm sure some of you in this webinar have been to some of the cemeteries, the battlefields. They're haunting, they're laid out beautifully. The young men, when you walk through the tombstones, you see the ages, and it just is so shocking. But this day, when I was there with my family, we, of course, walked around to see everything. There was over 2,000 graves there, but we particularly wanted to see anybody that was Jewish. And we went through some of them and, you know, noted down their names and put pebbles, of course, and noted where they were from. But this one particular grave leapt out at me from the earth after 70 years of being buried and said, find out who I am, how I got here, and my story. And so, of course, I read the tombstone, and on the bottom, it's a little bit hard to see, but the epitaph says, deeply mourned by wife and family, he died, so Jewry shall suffer no more. And this was the tombstone of George Meltz from Toronto. And so this launched me on my journey. And since then, I found out that he was one of the 450 Canadians of Jewish faith who did not come home from World War II, of the 17,000 Jewish boys and women who were there, Jewish men and women who served. And they fought not only for the country that they were in uniform, but also to save their own people from the Holocaust. And they fought at great personal risk should they be discovered by the enemy and become also a casualty or sent to the camps as well. Now, it's very important that this work is being done and has been done, because time is really almost running out. We lose about 13,000 veterans every single year in Canada, according to the latest statistics from Veterans Affairs Canada, of the 1 million who served. I'm not talking only about Jewish, but all races and creeds who served. And so it's very urgent that if you do have a veteran in your family who is still alive and is able to share their stories, you get them down on tape before it's too late. All right, second question is, what do you have? Well, if you're like me, you'll have had people. I had 9 people in my family who served. These are some of my great uncles, the Leaf brothers from Ottawa, a cousin who was killed in World War II from Timmins, Ontario. He was in the Air Force and he was on active service when he was killed. And an aunt, great aunt, who was one of the 270 women who were in service in Canadian uniform, Jewish women in World War II. And, you know, they never talked about it. Not to me, not to my parents or their generation too much, except maybe to a grandchild who would have said they needed an essay for Remembrance Day, and they asked their relatives, what did you do in the war? And usually, you know, most families would only be telling the good stuff, the jokes or the funny things that happened, because we now know it's PTSD. And in those days, they called it shell shock. So they didn't really talk about it. And then when I started researching in 2011, 12, it was really too late. Everybody had passed away except for one uncle. And again, he had never talked about it, not only to, you know, his wife, but even to his own children, very, very much. So this is why it's important to do. So what do you got? What do you have? And what do you want to know? Well, some of you may have personal effects and souvenirs, like these came back from Samuel Donin from Winnipeg. He was in Ferry Command, flying to Western Africa, flying new planes, new equipment, aircraft to help rebuild ones that had been shot down. And when he was obviously on leave, he collected some cool stuff, including an African knife. So do you have any souvenirs at home that people brought back? You might have, like George Meltz's niece, Isabella, she had his handkerchief that he'd sent home. You see, that's me and her. Several years ago, that he'd sent home to family members in training, but she didn't really know anything about him except a little bit before I started researching his story, because nobody really talked about it. Okay, so you maybe have that stuff. Now, thanks to the internet, it's a lot easier to find stuff nowadays than it ever was. So we're going to do this in two parts. The first one is going to be World War I files. Okay. There were, as I said, 4,700 Jewish personnel who served with the Canadian forces in World War I. All their files are digitized and online for free at Library and Archives Canada. So I'm just going to walk you through how to get them, and you could just print them out. You don't need to do anything. Library and Archives Canada in Ottawa on Wellington Street near the Parliament buildings. Of course, it's closed now to the public for coronavirus, but during the regular times, you can go in and visit and read them there, but you don't need to for this World War I files. All right, so here's some links for World War I to get their files. And this is what you'll get. The first part is general information and search tips, and the one underneath is the actual personnel records, because they've digitized all of them. And I'm going to show you for a second what it looks like. The things that when you go on to one of these links and you look for the files, you'll see something that looks like this. It's the attestation papers for an Abe Cohen who was from Montreal. And it tells you, there are two of them, two files that you can see. And it basically tells you the sign-up papers that he had. But don't just get satisfied with seeing these, because if you go down to the bottom of his entry, you will see that there is a PDF, all right, a PDF file. So if you go back just a little bit, you'll see the PDF file, and you can print it out. And it has his entire record. There's 45 pages. And you learn things like he was at he had a father, but he lived in an orphanage, that he was underage, that he was basically 17 when he signed up, and they caught him when he was in England, and they weren't impressed, but then they ended up sending him to France, and he became, he served through the entire World War I. And you find out, you know, his medical records, when he got into trouble, his health problems. And then from there, you can go ahead and search more using other sources. I'm going to share my screen again and show them to you. And other places to find the information about World War I is to go on to Veterans Affairs Canada's website, their virtual war memorial. And you enter the name and as much as you know, and usually it will help you to find a photo, a link to other information that the government has. Okay, that's the next step you should do. Now, if they were in World War I and they were casualties, my condolences to the family, but the Canadian Jewish Military Archives based in Montreal has a list of all the Canadians that they know of who were killed in World War I and World War II. And I think there's one from the Korean War as well. And it's a searchable database. So you can basically go and look, and it's small, there's not a lot there, but it's a lovely resource for people who don't have any information. And here's the link to the website itself. Now, for World War II, so much information, and it's really, really easy to get what you want. First of all, you have the same databases that I just told you to find people who were killed in World War II who were Jewish. But it's also for non-Jewish people as well. It's the same procedure. So this is the list of Jewish people that we know of that were killed, wounded, or taken prisoner by the end of the war. And you can also know their names because they're on war memorials all across country in Jewish cemeteries. This book, some of you may have, it is Canada's Jews in World War II, Volume 1 and Volume 2. There are these brown kind of Hilroy-sized books that were printed by Canada's Jewish community in the 40s, right after the war. And it has biographies. The ones that I showed you online that you can see from Canada's Jewish Military Archives are in this book. So if you have this book, you can't buy them anymore. It's very, very rare. You'll see these in hard copy, but all the stuff that's in this book is online in this military archives that I just showed you before. Pictures and the little write-up that was done in the newspaper when the casualties were reported or wounded or taken prisoner. Again, the same link. And you'll find things about all the 450 Canadians of Jewish faith who didn't come home in World War II and those who didn't come home in World War I. Now, Library and Archives Canada has an incredible resource, which is the Second World War service files. Now, over 1 million Canadians served, 44,000 were killed in World War II, among those, the 450 of Jewish faith. They're all here, but not all of them have been digitized. I would say maybe 2,000 have been digitized. The rest you have to order copies of, and they'll make copies for you for free, but it takes time. But you need to know the file number, and that's how you can find, if it's digitized, you can just download the whole thing yourself. So on this file, you search the database and the name comes up. You don't even need the service number. Don't worry if you don't know what their military service number is. Just put in their last name and they'll come up. And if there's a PDF file that's been digitized, it'll say, and you can just download it. If not, that's where you have to apply for their files. Another place, so you would get things like this. Their attestation papers for Joseph Girdle, who didn't come home. You get all kinds of incredible documents, copies, excuse me, of what the military has that was from the day they enlisted till the day either they were killed, and then all the paperwork was going on over a couple of years for the graves and sending their artifacts back to the family, and pensions and all that stuff, medals. And for those who are still alive and came home, a long file, probably up to 100 pages, but it won't have anything from Veterans Affairs in terms of current veterans services for them. This is just during the war files, okay? Still, it could get up to 100 pages. It's fascinating. So here's the link to digitize, to see if all your relatives were digitized. And if they're not, then you can request a copy of the files from Library and Archives Canada. So you can either do it online, or you can mail a form in. It's a one-page form. It's really easy. And you can take the form from my website and print it, fill it out as best as you can. They don't need everything. If you don't know everything, it's fine. They have good ways of researching it, and mail it into the address on the form. It takes about 10 months because they're so backlogged. And now with coronavirus, who knows how long it'll take. They are working, but they can't actually physically get in, I don't think, to the files to do the photocopying. So when you're asking for the files, ask for the full package. Don't ask just for, well, you could ask just for the 15 pages genealogical records. It's still interesting, but they don't have everything that would mean a lot to the family that maybe they wouldn't think was relevant, but you would want it. Ask for the whole thing, and they'll send it to you either on a disc or a USB or something, okay? So after you get that, there are other ways, or even if you don't want to wait that long, there are other places to get military records of those who were killed in World War II and I. Because the libraries are closed, you probably can't get this for free, but if the libraries do open, Ancestry is free in the library at the Toronto Public Library, at Richmond Hills Public Library, and several other, I'm sure, across the country public libraries. You can also get a little bit of a free trial to see what they have, and I subscribe to it because I need it for work, and I find it 100% so valuable. I think it's a couple $100 a year, but it's really worth it. Genie.com is another one. I think that's an Israeli one, but Israeli company, and also very worth it for people who are into genealogy and finding more about your family. But all the military records that of the 44,000 Canadians who were killed in World War II, the 15-page part that I just told you about, have been digitized on Ancestry. So you can get 15 pages. Sometimes there's way more if it's an interesting file, but you won't get it unless you can access it through the library or pay for the full subscription. So that's another really great resource. Then you can go to the websites of various other archives in Canada. Jewish Heritage Center, for example, of Western Canada and Winnipeg, they have an online database. So you could go and search there for all kinds of stuff about your relatives. when I went to the Montreal Jewish Archives, they have pages and pages of names of everybody who enlisted in World War II, because they collected all the 16,833 names, and the poor secretaries had to type them and then make copies on Gestetners, if you know what that is. So it's an old photocopy machine. So yeah, you could go and ask, or go online to the archives and see what they have, and then make requests for copies if you don't want to travel. In the archives, you'll find, including online, some unbelievable things. Here's what you'll find. You'll find, if they were killed, the personal effects that the sergeants and what have you would collect from the person's bunk, or if they were killed in the field, whatever they had on them, and send back to the family. So it's very heart-wrenching to see, a Jewish prayer book, an Italian fountain pen. This is Private Bernstein, who was from Toronto, excuse me, who was killed in Italy. And there's a chapel at the Jewish Community Center, Miles Nadal in Toronto, named after him. His brothers set that up after the war to commemorate him. So it's heart-wrenching to see what the family got back. Sometimes you'll find out that they got into trouble for breaking rules, or even got fined, or put in the clink for all kinds of infractions, going AWOL, for example. And you'll find their dental records. You'll also find, for example, how they died, because the charts from the field are in, where they were shot, or how much medication they were given. You'll also find treasures sometimes. This is a logbook, a flight book, belonging to Sam Donen from Winnipeg. He was the one I told you about, who was in the Ferry Command and had those cool African souvenirs. In 1940, so when I was looking through it, in 1947, the military had tried to mail this diary that he kept of all his flights to the family, but the family had moved. So basically it's from 1947 until I was there, this diary, which they were supposed to send to the family, to the father, had been sitting in storage in Ottawa. So I found it, and the government said, sure, we'll mail it to the family. The family was stunned, floored, because it's their actual property. If he had come home, he would have given it to them. He would have brought it back. So anything that's in there that was his property is the family. So you may find things like their pay books, which you should have, these diaries, which you should have, and they'll send them to you. You have to just ask for them. It's free. There's Samuel Donen in his flight suits and with his family before he was overseas, and then overseas. He was killed in a plane crash in Ghana. You'll also find things maybe that you didn't want to know, or that you never knew, family history from the war, that the family had never known. Why Rose Goodman, for example, was killed. She was the only Canadian Jewish woman killed in World War II in uniform, and she was the only officer in the RCAF, and a wonderful, amazing, tragic loss. So she was killed in a training plane in Alberta. She was at an air base there as their adjutant, and the family always thought it was just a training accident, and they never knew what actually happened to her, and that was fine. No one told them. She died a heroine, and is buried in Montreal, where the family had plots, because they were from Nova Scotia. But in her file was the true story of what happened. It was not a training accident at all, and it was a tragic death. And the RCMP had to do a whole investigation of how it came to be that she was on this plane that ended up crashing in the middle of a field after a wedding. Sad story. It's all in my book. And you'll find things about, if you have a box, like the family of Benny Yellen has a box, and I interviewed them. They're in California now, going through the box, and they finding all his photos and paper from the government. And it's so heartwarming and inspiring to see why he enlisted. And you'll see that it says, I want to desire to help end this war, in which I have a great interest due to race persecution and my interest in navigation, and of course, very confident young man. So the box, everyone has a box. Here's the box that belongs to the family of Dick Steele and Bill Walsh of Toronto. Dick Steele was killed in World War II. His best friend, Bill Walsh, earned medals and was an officer and was written up in the newspapers for his heroic actions in Europe. And then Bill came home and remarried the widow of Dick and raised his children as they had promised each other they would do in the field. This is a box full of letters and documents that the family had never really they couldn't open it. It was years, 70 years, they couldn't open it. So through my help and going through the files, they were able to piece together the true story. And there's Mike Steele with me, his son looking through the box. So if you have a box and it's coronavirus, this is the time to get the files, read them, and then ask Ottawa for the files and put the story together. There's Dick Steele. He was a big labor leader in the Steelworkers Union, and his best friend, Bill Walsh, with his first wife, who was also killed. It's a whole story. It's a beautiful, sad, tragic story. And then at the end, it's a love story. Now, I've talked long enough. I hope that this has been informational and helpful to you. There's way more ways to research, but it's enough for one day. My book is here, Double Threat. It's published by the University of Toronto Press. If you have questions, there's my email address. Please feel free to buy the book at any of your favorite booksellers. It's available online. So I'm here to help you. I thank you for your attention, and thanks for watching.